"Don't bother Grandma with your problems," my son said to his children through the kitchen wall. "She gets confused. You know how she is." I stood very still, a dish towel in my hands, and let those words settle into me. For 31 years, I had held a scalpel over open human hearts, and not one of them had ever broken the way mine did in that moment. But I smiled, because what my son did not know, what none of them knew, was exactly who I had been before I became just Grandma. My name is Eleanor Marsh. I am 69 years old, and I live in a small house on Birch Lane in Caldwell, Ohio, where I grow tomatoes in the summer, read medical journals in the fall, and keep 4 cats I did not set out to adopt. From the outside, I suppose I look like any other retired woman of a certain age. Gray cardigan, reading glasses on a chain. Hair I have not bothered to dye since Richard passed. I imagine, exactly like someone whose grandchildren should not trouble themselves over. But before I was just Grandma, I was Dr. Eleanor Marsh, and I was one of the first female cardiothoracic surgeons in the state of Ohio. I trained under Dr. Harold Weiss at Cleveland General Hospital at a time when women in surgery were treated as either a curiosity or an inconvenience, depending on the day and the man. I graduated first in my class from the University of Michigan Medical School in 1979, the first woman to do so, out of a class of 94 students, most of whom were very certain I would not last the year. Over the course of my career, I performed over 3,000 open heart surgeries. 3,000. Human hearts, opened and repaired, and returned to beating in the chests of people who went home and lived their lives and never needed to know my name. I hold a patent on a modified annuloplasty ring for mitral valve repair that is still in use in hospitals in Canada, Germany, and Australia today. I published 41 peer-reviewed papers in journals, including the Journal of the American Medical Association, the Annals of Thoracic Surgery, and the New England Journal of Medicine. I received the Ohio Medical Association's Distinguished Physician Award in 2001, and I received it again in 2007. I retired in 2018. Not because I was confused, not because I was slowing, but because I had given 31 years to that operating room and I wanted to grow tomatoes and let my hands rest. My son David is 42 years old. He works in commercial real estate in Columbus. He is not a cruel man, and I want to be careful to say that plainly, because the story I am about to tell you could make him sound like one, and the truth is always more complicated than the version that makes a clean villain. David is a man who was raised by a mother who worked very long hours and came home tired, who sat at the dinner table and drifted into thoughts about surgical outcomes and post-operative complications and the particular logistics of the human heart. He was 4 years old when I started my residency. He grew up with the outline of my career, the late nights, the missed dinners, the beeper that went off at 2 a.m, without ever fully grasping its substance. He knew I was a doctor. He did not know what it costs a woman to walk into a room of men who have already decided she is temporary, and to perform so completely and so consistently that eventually they are no longer capable of thinking of her that way. His wife, Sandra, is an organized woman. She runs their household, their social calendar, and, beginning in 2020, her mother-in-law. That is the word I use for it. Organized. She began organizing me the year Richard died. Richard died in November of 2019. Pancreatic cancer, swift and absolute, the way it tends to be. We had 41 years together, Richard and I will not attempt to describe what losing him felt like because words precise enough for that do not exist, and imprecise ones would insult the experience. What I will say is that afterward I was changed. Not confused, not declining. Changed. The way everything changes when you lose the person who has known you longest. I was slower. I was quieter. I forgot things. Not consequential things, not things with weight, but the small things that grief loosens when it works through you. A birthday, an appointment, the name of someone I had met only twice. I cried sometimes at the kitchen table on ordinary Tuesday afternoons for no reason I could have articulated. I sought help. I worked with a therapist named Dr. Carol Baines, a woman with an office in Columbus and the particular gift of sitting in silence without filling it. I processed the grief honestly and without self-pity and at the pace grief requires, not the pace other people's comfort would prefer. By 2021, I was very much myself again. But David had already filed the folder. In 2020, watching his mother cry on ordinary Tuesdays and forget a birthday and sometimes lose a sentence mid-thought, He had categorized her as declining, and he had never revisited that categorization. The birthday I forgot became evidence. The Tuesday crying became evidence. The afternoon I lost my train of thought mid-sentence, which happens to surgeons at the height of their careers, which happens to every human being who has ever been tired, became evidence of something permanent. He was frightened. I understand that. Watching grief from the outside, when you love the person and don't have language for what you're actually seeing, is frightening in a way that begs simplification. Fear, left unexamined, becomes certainty. His certainty became a story he told Sandra. The story he told Sandra became the story he told his children. And so Grandma became someone to be managed rather than known. I began to notice the texture of it, the way I had once noticed the earliest signs of trouble in post-operative patients. Not with alarm, but with the careful, trained attention of someone who has spent decades reading what other people overlook. It was the way David redirected conversations. He would let me finish a thought and then say, warmly, patiently, "Right, Mom. Anyway," and pivot somewhere else entirely, the way you redirect a small child who has said something sweet but tangential while the adults are discussing important matters. It happened so consistently and so gently that I might have missed it if I were not, by nature and by 40 years of practice, someone who notices things. There was a particular afternoon at Thanksgiving when I was telling Sandra's parents, visiting from Cincinnati, about the work I had done with Dr. Weiss in the early 80s, a new approach to valve repair we had developed together that later informed my patent. Sandra's father had leaned forward with genuine interest. He was an engineer, and the mechanics of it spoke to him. And we had begun to have what was becoming a real conversation, the kind where one person says something and the other person's face changes with recognition. And then David, very gently, very warmly, said, "Mom, you've told that story a few times today," which was not true. It was the first time. And I watched Sandra's father sit back slightly, recalibrating, looking at me with new eyes, the ones that say perhaps this woman is not quite as reliable as she seemed. I looked at my son. He was smiling. He genuinely believed he was helping me. It was the Sunday calls from Sandra. Every Sunday, 11 in the morning, clockwork. Just checking in, Eleanor. A pleasant, brief conversation about nothing consequential. The weather, the grandchildren's schedules, whether I needed anything from the grocery store. These calls were not unfriendly. They were the calls you make to someone you are monitoring. She offered to drive me to my medical appointments more than once. She offered twice in a single autumn to help me organize my finances, suggesting that having a second pair of eyes might ease the burden. My finances, which I have managed without complication or assistance since before Sandra was born. But it was the grandchildren that moved me most deeply and most quietly. There are 3 of them. Mia, who is 17 and wants to be a writer, who has her father's eyes and her own thinking entirely. Jake, who is 15 and already taller than David and inclined toward long questions and longer silences in which he processes things before speaking. And Lily, who is 11 and still young enough to fall asleep in my lap without embarrassment and who draws constantly, narrating her drawings in a soft, continuous murmur as she works. These 3 children had been given a version of me. A careful, limited version. Grandma who gets confused. Grandma who should nurse. Grandma who shouldn't be troubled. Mia said it plainly, the way 17-year-olds say things plainly before they have learned to soften them. We were in my living room last spring, and she mentioned a school project, and she said, looking at the wall rather than at me, casually, the way you report known facts, "Dad says you were a nurse, Grandma. He says you worked really hard, a nurse. I, who had repaired 3,000 hearts. I, who had been published in JAMA. I, who had taught surgical residents and held a patent. A nurse, in the way a concert pianist is someone who plays piano. I said her father was right, that I had worked very hard, and I smiled, and I changed the subject, because I did not know yet what I was going to do about any of it. The decision arrived the way the most important decisions do. Not as a single moment of revelation, but as the slow accumulation of small moments reaching a point of quiet inevitability. It was the Sunday afternoon 2 weeks before Christmas. David and Sandra had brought the children for what Sandra called an early holiday visit, which I understood to be a wellness check conducted under festive cover. After lunch, the children dispersed in the natural way. Jake on the couch with headphones, Lily at the kitchen table with her sketchbook, Sandra in the kitchen washing dishes despite my having asked her not to. David settled into Richard's chair with his phone, and I was putting dishes away, and I could hear him through the kitchen wall, speaking to the children in a low and instructional voice. Don't bother Grandma with your problems. She gets confused. You know how she is. I stood still, the dish towel in my hands. I let the words arrive and settle and be fully what they were. Then I set the towel down, walked back into the living room, smiled at my son and his family, and said nothing at all. But I was deciding. The way I used to decide, in the quiet before the first incision, with complete calm and complete clarity and no uncertainty at all about what came next. I called Patricia that night. Dr. Patricia Chen, who has been my closest friend since we sat next to each other in biochemistry at Michigan in 1975, and she borrowed my pencil and never returned it. And I never bothered to ask for it back because by the following week, I already knew she was someone I wanted to keep. She became a pediatric oncologist, which requires a specific kind of soul, the kind that can hold a dying child's hand and not look away. She retired 3 years before I did to a house in Scottsdale, where she plays tennis 4 mornings a week and maintains a garden that her homeowners association has tried and failed to regulate. She is the most honest person I know. She is the only person I know who has never, in 50 years, told me a comforting lie. I told her everything. The kitchen wall, the Sunday calls, the Thanksgiving interruption, Mia saying she was a nurse. The 17-year-old girl sitting across from me in my living room saying she didn't know what she wanted to do with her life in the voice of someone asking a question they don't expect answered. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Ellie, when was the last time you showed them?" "Showed them what?" "Who you are," she said. "Not who you were, who you are." Because the woman I have known for 50 years has never once waited for someone's permission to occupy a room. I said nothing. "Tell them," she said. Not to correct David. Not to win anything. Tell them because that girl sitting across from you saying she doesn't know what she wants needs to see what a woman who didn't know what she wanted actually did with that feeling. Tell them because those children deserve the real version of their grandmother. Right now, they're working from a very poor copy. I hung up and sat in my reading chair for a long time. My gray tabby, Elliot, settled on my feet. Outside, the first snow of December had started. I had a plan. I spent the following 2 weeks in my study, the small room off the hallway that David once called my cluttered office, gathering things with the methodical attention I had once given pre-operative checklists. I am not a sentimental woman, but I am a precise one, and I had kept everything that mattered. My University of Michigan diploma was in a cardboard tube in the back of the closet, never framed, because Richard had always said we would have it properly framed, and we simply never got around to it, which is one of the small regrets I carry easily, because the life around it was so full. My Ohio Medical Association certificates hung behind the study door in frames that no one stood close enough to read. My published papers were in organized binders on the lower shelf. The patent certificate. The acceptance letter from the editor of JAMA for my 2003 paper on mitral valve repair outcomes. A letter I had read so many times the fold lines had gone soft. And a photograph from graduation day in 1979. My mother standing beside me in bright June sun, both of us squinting at the camera, her hand gripping my arm the way she always gripped, things she was proud of and didn't want to let go of. I made copies of everything. I organized 3 folders, one for each grandchild, with care and with intention. For Lily, I wrote simple explanatory notes in language an 11-year-old could hold. For Jake, I went into the engineering, the physics of valve mechanics, the pressure differentials, the mathematical precision that surgery requires when it is done correctly. For Mia, I did something different entirely. I wrote her a letter, 4 pages, handwritten, because some things should not be typed. I told her about being 18 years old and not knowing what I wanted to do with my life. The exact feeling of it, the frustration and the guilt of not knowing, as if not knowing were a failure rather than simply the beginning. I told her about sitting alone in the university library in Ann Arbor in October of 1973, reading an article about the first women attempting cardiothoracic surgery and feeling something ignite in my chest. A word I use with full precision that I had never felt before in my life. I told her about the professor in my second year who told me, flatly and without apology, that women did not belong in surgery, and the exact words I said back to him, which I will not repeat here, but which Patricia recounts at dinner parties with considerable satisfaction to this day. I told her about the first surgery I performed entirely alone. No attending, no safety net, only my team and my hands and 30 months of practice. And how my hands were steady, not because I was born steady, but because I had made them steady. Because I had practiced until steadiness was not something I chose, but something I was. I told her about Richard, who believed in me years before I could manage to believe in myself, and how that kind of love, the kind that sees you more clearly than you see yourself and holds that seeing gently without demanding you catch up, is the rarest thing in the world and worth any amount of waiting. I told her that not knowing what you want at 17 is not a deficiency. It is the only honest place to begin. I folded the letter and placed it in her folder, and I waited for Christmas. Christmas fell on a Thursday. David and Sandra arrived with the children at 11 in the morning, and by noon, the house was warm with cinnamon and the comfortable noise of 3 grandchildren moving through it and 2 adults performing relaxation. I let the afternoon breathe. I helped Sandra in the kitchen when she permitted it. I watched David sit in Richard's chair and scroll his phone, and I felt something move through me that was not anger, not grief, but something older and more settled. The clarity I used to feel in the operating room in the moment before the first incision, when everything unnecessary has been put aside and what remains is only the work. I asked Lily first, because she is 11, and because beginning with the youngest felt structurally correct, the way you begin a repair at the foundation. Lily, come sit with me in the study for a few minutes? She came without hesitation, spinning the desk chair once in the way all children spin desk chairs, and sat across from me with the open, slightly watchful attention of a child who has learned to be curious without fully committing to it yet. I put the folder on the desk between us. I want to show you some things about my life, I said. Things you might not know. I started with the graduation photograph. My mother and I in June's sun, 1979. Lily touched the photograph with one careful finger. You look so young, she said. I was 24, I said. I had just finished medical school. Dad says you were a nurse, she said, not as an accusation, just reporting what she had been given. I know, I said. Your father remembers things from when he was very small, and some of those memories got mixed up over time. I was a surgeon, Lily, a heart surgeon. When a person's heart had something wrong with it, a valve that didn't close correctly, an artery that had become too narrow, I would go in and repair it, with a team of very skilled people who each knew exactly what they were doing. And that person would wake up and go home and live the rest of their life. I did that more than 3,000 times. She looked at me with the expression of someone quietly revising a picture they thought was finished. I showed her the patent certificate. I explained what a patent was. That I had designed a small piece of equipment so effective that it was being used right now, today, while we sat here, in hospitals, in Canada and Germany and Australia, in the chests of people who had no idea who had made the thing keeping them alive. She looked at the certificate for a long time. Can I keep this? She asked. I told her it was hers. I had made it for her. Jake followed me to the study with the practiced casualness of a 15-year-old trying to conceal his interest, which collapsed the moment I put the folder in front of him and he leaned forward entirely. I gave him the science, pressure gradients, fluid dynamics, the mitral valve, what it does, what failure looks like from inside a chest, what repair requires in terms of timing and precision, and the kind of focus that cannot be borrowed or performed but must be cultivated over years. I watched his face change as the engineering clicked into place. He asked me 3 questions, each more specific than the last. I answered them precisely and completely. He sat back. Grandma, he said, did you actually publish in the New England Journal of Medicine? Twice, I said, and JAMA and the Annals of Thoracic Surgery. 41 papers in total. He stared at me. Then he laughed, a quick, honest, involuntary laugh, and said, Dad is going to lose his mind. He caught himself. Sorry, Grandma. Don't apologize, I said. He very well might. With Mia, I waited. I stayed in the study, putting things in order, and I heard her knock on the open door, and I turned to find her standing in the doorway with her arms loosely crossed, her posture arranged to suggest only mild curiosity. Lily said you had something for us, she said. Come in, I said. Close the door. She sat across from me, and I put the folder on the desk, and I placed the letter on top of it. 4 pages, folded in thirds, her name written on the outside in my handwriting. "Read that first," I said. "Take all the time you need." She unfolded it and began to read, and I turned to face the window, giving her the privacy of reading without being watched. Outside, the December dark had fully arrived. I could see the faint reflection of us both in the glass, the girl reading and the woman waiting. And I thought of my mother gripping my arm in the June sun, and I thought of Richard, and I thought of the operating room at 2 a.m. when the hospital was quiet and the work was all there was, and I was content. I heard the change in her breathing about halfway through. That particular tightening. I did not turn. When she set the letter down, she was quiet for a long moment. I turned to her then. She had been crying. Not the performed kind, not the kind that announces itself, but the real kind. The kind that arrives before you have decided to allow it. "You said you didn't know what you wanted," she said. Her voice was careful and precise, the voice of someone selecting words from a much larger feeling. "You were 18 and you didn't know, and then you found it." "I found something that lit me up," I said, "and I followed it, not as a plan, as a direction, and I walked in it as far as it would take me." She was quiet. Then, "Dad told us you have memory problems, that you get confused sometimes. She said it the way you repeat something you're ashamed to have believed." "I was grieving your grandfather," I said. "Grief looks like confusion when you're watching someone you love go through it and you don't have language for what you're actually seeing. Your father was frightened for me, and he turned that fear into a story that felt easier to carry. I understand why he did it. I don't hold it against him." "He told us you were just a nurse," she said. "He said it more than once, Grandma. He said it as a fact, not as a mistake. I want you to know I understand now that it wasn't true, but I need you to know that's what we were told, as a fact." "I know," I said. "How does someone not know what their own mother spent her entire life doing?" The question came out sharper than she intended, and I saw her register it. "He was 4 years old when I started," I said. "He grew up watching me work without understanding what I was working at. And when I got quieter after your grandfather died, it was easier to believe I was diminishing than to revisit everything he had already decided about me. We build stories about the people we love. Sometimes we forget to update them. Sometimes we stop looking at the person and just look at the story instead." She looked at me for a long time. "You're not confused at all," she said. Not a question. A correction she was making to something she had carried? "No," I said. "Not even a little," she cried then. Properly, with her whole face, her hands coming up and then dropping. The kind of crying that happens when something you've been told is truth turns out to be wrong, and the wrongness has real weight in it. I sat with her. I did not try to redirect it or soften it or hurry past it. I simply sat the way I had sat with 1,000 families in waiting rooms, knowing that the most useful thing is sometimes only to be present while someone arrives at the truth at their own pace. When she was done, she looked at me with the particular clarity that follows a real cry. "I want to read everything in that folder," she said. "It's yours," I said. "I made it for you." She went out to the living room with the folder held against her chest and her composure held carefully in both hands. She set the folder on the coffee table and opened it, and she said, to the room at large, to David looking up from Richard's chair, to Sandra still at the kitchen threshold, "Did you know Grandma has a patent?" David looked up. "What?" "A patent. On a surgical device being used in hospitals in 3 countries right now, today, while we are sitting here." She was not angry. She was something more unsettling than angry. She was composed. She was reading from documents, because she had documents now, and documents do not raise their voices. She published 41 peer-reviewed papers. She won the Distinguished Physician Award twice. She graduated first in her class at the University of Michigan Medical School. First, out of 94 students. David looked at the papers spread across the coffee table. I watched his face move through several expressions. Puzzlement first, then the reflexive dismissal of someone encountering information that does not fit their existing model. And then, slowly, like light moving through clouded glass, recognition. He looked up at me. "Mom," he said. "You're welcome to go through everything," I said. "I made copies." Sandra had picked up the Distinguished Physician Award certificate and was reading it with the focused, still attention of someone reassessing a situation they had believed they understood. Jake had materialized from the couch, fully alert, watching his father and me with the expression of someone observing a calibration in real time. Lily was sitting cross-legged on the floor with the patent certificate in her lap, tracing the letters with one finger the way she had traced the graduation photograph. "Why didn't you ever talk about this?" David said. "I talked about it for 31 years, I said. You were 4 when it started. You were in your 40s when it ended. There was talking about it in the middle. But at some point, you had already decided what my story was, and new information stopped changing it. I said it without sharpness, without accusation, the way you state something that is simply and factually true." He picked up one of the journal articles. He read the title. He set it down. He picked up another. His hands, Richard's hands, the same shape and the same steadiness, moved through the papers with a care that looked almost like reverence, the way you handle things you should have looked at a long time ago. "I told the kids not to bother you," he said. His voice was careful and quiet. "I told them you got confused." Each sentence arrived with weight. "I was in the kitchen," I said. "I heard you." The room held the specific silence of a space in which something true has been named, and no one has yet determined what to do with it. Sandra set down the certificate. "David," she said, very quietly, "just his name. The way wives say names when they know their husband needs to arrive at something without being directed." He looked at me across the living room. My son, with Richard's hands and my stubbornness and a fear of being wrong that has followed him since childhood like a second shadow. I watched him sit with what he now knew. I waited. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. "I've been carrying a story about you that wasn't true, and I gave it to my children as if it were fact." He stopped. Then, "That was wrong." "Yes," I said. "It was." Sandra looked at me directly. "I made assumptions instead of asking questions. I'm sorry, Eleanor." She said it simply and without ceremony, which is the only form an apology takes when it's real. "Thank you," I said. It was Mia who said, quietly, to her father, "There's a letter in my folder, Dad. She wrote it to you in 1982. She wrote it when you were little and she never sent it." David stared at her. "What? A letter? About her work, about what she hoped you'd understand one day." I had placed it in Mia's folder without fully deliberating about it. A letter I had written to a 4-year-old David after a long surgical shift in the winter of 1982, folded into a plain envelope with his name on it, never sent, kept in a box for 4 decades because I hadn't known what else to do with it. Mia had found it and named it before I could decide what I intended. I sat with that, and I let it be. David asked, very quietly, if he could read it. I said yes. He sat back in Richard's chair and he read, and when he finished, he held the letter in his lap and was still for a long time, looking at the ceiling. Then he folded it very carefully and held it with both hands. "Why didn't you send it?" he asked. "You were 4, I said. "And then you were older, and it felt like too long ago. And then it was 40 years, and I had almost forgotten it was there." He nodded, still looking at the letter in his hands. "I would have wanted to read it," he said. "Even if I couldn't understand it yet. I know that now," I said. That Christmas ended differently than I had imagined it. Not in confrontation or in triumph, but in the slower, more sustaining way of things that have been made right after being wrong for too long. We had dinner a second time, late in the evening, because no one was ready to leave. The children asked me questions. Real questions, not the managed kind, not the questions you ask someone you've been told to be gentle with, but the forward-leaning, specific kind. What was your first surgery like? Did you ever lose someone? What did Grandpa think the first time he watched you work? I answered all of them. I talked until Lily fell asleep in her chair with a crayon still loosely in her hand, until Jake was asking follow-up questions that were clearly designed to extend the conversation rather than to gather new information. Until Sandra, refilling coffee cups, said quietly, "I didn't know, Eleanor. I genuinely didn't know, and I looked at her and believed her completely and told her so." At the end of the night, in the hallway, Mia hugged me the way she used to when she was small. Not the careful sideways hug of a teenager performing affection, but the real kind, both arms, her chin on my shoulder. "Grandma," she said very quietly, "I want to know everything. You know where I live," I said. She pulled back and looked at me with her father's eyes and her own mind entirely. "I might want to write about you," she said. "Is that okay?" Only if you get it right, I said. She said she would try. I believe her. I have thought often, in the weeks since that Christmas, about what it means to allow yourself to be reduced. It is never a single decision. It is a long series of small non-decisions, moments when a wrong assumption presents itself and you do not correct it, because correcting it feels like arguing, or because you are tired, or because the person making the assumption loves you and you do not want to make things difficult. The reductions accumulate. The story calcifies. And one day you find yourself standing in your own kitchen with a dish towel in your hands, listening to your son describe you to your grandchildren in terms that bear no resemblance to the life you have actually lived. I am not angry with David. I have said that, and I mean it precisely. He was frightened and working from incomplete information, and he turned both of those things into a story that felt manageable. That is a very human response to fear. What I needed was not to punish him for it, but to correct it. For myself, yes, but more for those 3 children, and most of all for Mia, the 17-year-old girl sitting across from me in my living room saying she didn't know what she wanted to do with her life in the voice of someone afraid that not knowing is already a failure. You are not obligated to be the most convenient version of yourself. You are not obligated to stay quiet while people who love you maintain their assumptions about you in peace, and if no one hands you the moment. If the moment is not given, then you gather your documents and you write your letters and you make your copies and you wait for Christmas. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to say, clearly and without apology, I was a surgeon. 3,000 hearts, 41 papers, 2 awards, a patent used in 3 countries. I was this, entirely and for a long time, and the woman sitting in front of you right now is that woman, and has been that woman every day since, whether you knew it or not. Since that Christmas, Mia has called me 4 times. Jake emailed me a journal article about a new approach to minimally invasive mitral valve repair and asked if I had read it. I had. I sent him back my own annotations, 3 pages of them, and he called the next evening to discuss. Lily made me a card, handmade, crayon on construction paper, with a drawing of a heart with small wings, that says World's Greased Heartfeiser in uneven capital letters. It is on my refrigerator between a photograph of Richard on our wedding day and a coupon for cat food I keep forgetting to redeem. David called on a Tuesday, not the Sunday check-in call. Not Sandra's clockwork 11 o'clock wellness call. David, on a Tuesday afternoon, because he wanted to. He asked me what medical school was like. He asked me about the first woman I ever saw perform surgery. He listened for 45 minutes without redirecting once, and at the end he said, "Mom, I'm sorry I wasn't paying better attention." I told him he was paying attention now, and that was the part that still counted. I meant every word of that. I am not a woman who says things she does not mean. That is what I have learned at 69 years old, after all the hearts and all the papers, and 41 years with Richard and the grief that followed, and the tomatoes and the cats, and this particular December. The story does not end until it has to. Until then, there is time. To revise. To correct. To hand someone a folder of documents and a handwritten letter and say, "Here is who I actually am. Here is who I have been. Every single day, since long before you knew me. You simply were not paying close enough attention. Start now. We still have time." If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? And from where in the world are you listening? I read every message, and you mean more to me than you know. For more stories like this one, like this video, and subscribe. There is so much more waiting for you. With love and respect. Until next time.